Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to be going over the history and geography of Rwanda. And we're very zoomed in on this country because it's a small one. It's the third smallest country in Africa. Let me get my pencil out so I can show you all the little details. So Rwanda is landlocked. It is bordered by the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi. Rwanda is known as the land of 1,000 hills, and pretty much the entire country is very hilly. Nothing like massive mountain ranges in most of it, mostly just hills. It reminds me kind of like how Los Angeles is hilly and flat in some parts, but very hilly in others. It's sort of like that. Except for this region over here. This is where we get more of the mountains. So, Rwanda is part of the East African Rift, where two tectonic plates are pulling apart, and thus it creates all of these interesting lakes all around the country, all around its border. And because it's pulling apart, it's also creating a lot of interesting volcanoes and hot springs and, creates earthquakes and things like that. So this, if you can see right here, is called Volcano National Park. And the highest point is right here on the border of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Rwanda. It's Mount Karisimbi, and this is known, as you can see right here, the Virunga mountain range. Very close to the earthquake zone here in the DRC. The Volcanoes National Park is a really interesting place, not just for the volcanoes, which are mostly extinct. I think there's a couple active ones, but they're not nearly as active as the ones that are over here. They're neighbors' backyard, I suppose. But it is in this national park where you can find most of the world's mountain gorillas. Very rare, very beautiful animal that needs to be protected at all costs, in my opinion. Bless you, kitty. My cat's sleeping right by the desk. Rwanda has lots of wonderful animals in it, but that's by far the one that needs to be protected the most, as you can imagine. The big lake you can see right here, created by the East African Rift, is Lake Kivu. All around the border here, there are resort towns and beautiful beach resorts and hotels, and it's like the big vacation spot in Rwanda. Lots of tourists there too. The capital city is right here, pretty much smack dab in the middle of the country. It is Kigali. And honestly, that's about it. There are lots of rivers around here. The Kagera River flows up here, creating the border over here, and flows into Lake Victoria. I just covered Burundi yesterday. Be sure to check that out. But this river is believed to be the source of the Nile. It's very debatable because there are lots of other rivers that flow into and out of this river. So it's possible that's the start of the Nile, but highly debated. And you can see lots of the lakes over here. There's Lake Ihima, the Kagera National Park around the Kagera River. And honestly, like I said, it's a very small country, so that's pretty much it for its geography, but it's a gorgeous little country. Let's talk about its history, because even though it's a very beautiful country, it has one of the saddest histories out of any country in the world, in my opinion. So, if you've seen my Burundi video, the first couple of minutes is going to be a bit repetitive because they have a very shared history for almost all of it. But if you haven't seen it yet, you'll learn something interesting. So, there have been people in Rwanda since there have been people on Earth. There's lots of Stone Age tools that have been found and lots of evidence of very early man living in the area. The earliest known ethnic peoples in this area would have been the Twa. Eventually, the Bantu migration came through the area. And there are many different branches of Bantu people, but the two that became most known in the area would have been the Hutus and the Tutsis. They came sometime between 700 BCE and 1500 CE. It's very debated if they came slowly or came all at once, or if one came and then the other started to take over and push against the other. We may never know, honestly, but what we do know is that by the 1700s, the clans in the area started to turn into kingdoms. There were about 8 kingdoms at the time. The strongest would have been the Kingdom of Rwanda. And this was a Tutsi kingdom. So what mainly distinguished the Hutu from Tutsi is that the Hutus were considered farming people. The Tutsis were considered the cattle ranching people. And the Twa are still there. They're considered like the forest jungle people in a way. Like the more, I don't want to say more primitive, but at the time they were considered the more primitive people. The Tutsi, really, in a sense, were considered socially to be the more higher up, more important culture, because cows are very, very valuable in Rwanda. Even to this day, cows are considered by far important. Like in Rwandan weddings, you give a cow to the bride, like the groom's family. It's still a thing today. And like I did mention in my Burundi video, it may not be entirely an ethnic difference, but a cultural one as well, or like a socioeconomic one even, because it was possible for a Hutu to garner enough wealth and even cattle to be considered Tutsi. And it was possible for a Tutsi to lose their wealth and be considered Hutu. But, the clans argued and what have you. It's not a lot of land. As the populations boomed, the land became more sparse and more arguments start. But it gets much, much worse later. Let's hold that thought. The Berlin Conference of 1884, also known as the Scramble for Africa, was when the major European powers got together and decided what parts of Africa they would take. And this area was given to Germany. There was a German exploration into Rwanda in 1894. The Germans got along very well with the Rwandan kings, and even though they were in control of this area, they let the kings rule as they always had. Then World War I happens, right? And the Allies managed to invade and take over and occupy the area by 1916. At the end of the war, it was given to the Belgians, since the Belgians controlled the Congo over here. It was made into one big Belgian colony called Rwanda, Urundi. And the Belgians really favored the Tutsi side in the whole Tutsi-Hutu dynamic, to the point where they issued ID cards for everyone that stated whether or not they were Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. And this is the point when the two clans of Hutu and Tutsi really started to clash, because now there was a legal difference between these people, even though technically there really isn't much of a difference. I'm just getting ahead of myself. There isn't really a difference, but at the time there was a massive one. That tension between both groups led to the Rwandan Revolution of 1959. There were lots of riots and attacks on Tutsi due to how their leadership was treating the Hutu. It was a rough start to their road to independence. Independence was eventually granted on July 1st, 1962 from the Belgians. But it didn't help to slow the cycle of violence that was occurring. It was like a Hutu would attack an important Tutsi, so the Tutsis would attack the Hutus. And it would just go back and forth. There would be some important figure from one side who would be killed, and then the group would rise up and start fighting back against others. A civil war broke out in 1990. Some Tutsi who had fled, I believe it was to Uganda, came back with a vengeance and started to just start mowing down the Hutu. And it was rough. It was a big precursor to what's about to happen. But that's when the violence in the 1990s really took off. There was a ceasefire, but it didn't last very long because an airplane that carried the presidents of both Rwanda and Burundi was shot down in 1994. And that was the last straw for the Hutus. That day, they announced that they were going to kill every Tutsi in Rwanda, and thus sparked the Rwandan genocide. Now, I always say on my channel that, when terrible things happen, I gloss over it for the purposes of relaxation. Not that I'm diminishing it, not that I'm making fun of it, definitely. And, I'm not saying that it wasn't a big deal. It definitely was, but on this channel, we don't get into the details of horrors that occur just because it's not relaxing at all. So let me just say that the Rwandan genocide was very shocking. Obviously there have been bigger genocides, but it was just the speed and efficiency of how it occurred. It was literally like they said on the radio, like, we're coming for you, run or you won't make it another day, in a way. In the course of around 100 days, there were around 500,000 to 1 million Tutsis who lost their lives. It was 70% of the Tutsi population of Rwanda. There's a really good movie called Hotel Rwanda with Don Cheadle. Yeah, check that movie out. I mean, it's very heavy, it's very dark, but it really shows you just the scope of how quickly and how ruthlessly this genocide occurred. Afterward, once the world was really realizing what was happening, for instance, this is kind of gory, but I mentioned the Kagera River, how they were dumping bodies into the river and they would wash up in Lake Victoria into Uganda. So Uganda's like, something's going on, this is not good. And what was it? It was, I was listening, this was a couple of years ago, to she wasn't a survivor because she was living in America at the time, but her family was in Rwanda. And she was trying to speak out to the press about what was happening to her family, but this was during the OJ trials. So the media was focused entirely on that and didn't care about some tiny nation, But once the world did realize what was happening over here, it was a shock. Many Hutus fled into, it was known as Zaire at the time, fearing reprisals. That led to a lot of unrest in that area. All the neighbors of the country in general had a huge wave of refugees, either Tutsi or Hutu, that really affected them economically. But an international criminal tribunal was formed by the UN not long after that, just a few months later, to figure out what happened here and who was responsible and who should be charged for the crimes committed there. And they did indeed run trials. I believe most of the people that they arrested pled guilty. And yeah, the government of Rwanda really took a step back and said that this can never happen again. And they made a lot of small changes to the country since it's very poor, very small. You know, most of the people just got ruthlessly slaughtered. So, sorry, this is really heavy. They implemented very, very small things like a community day every month where everyone has the day off and they pick up trash, or they gave a cow to every person in the country. They outlawed plastic bags, just like very tiny little things. In 2000, they started their Vision 2020 campaign, which was to turn the country around by the year 2020. And they really did succeed. The country is vastly growing economically in pretty much every sector. It's considered one of the least corrupt countries in Africa. Kigali is considered the cleanest city in Africa, I believe, or at least one of the cleanest cities. I think it was the cleanest city. It's just really on the rise, and is a country to really keep an eye on, because it just seems like only good things as a whole have been coming out of the country. The only concern is that their president, who is very, very beloved, I should say, he's the one responsible for the recovery of the country, has decided to run for more than 2 terms and is still president today, which is always a concern. But like I said, he's beloved in the country, so you know, there is a big checks and balances in the country. The whole Hutu Tutsi thing is pretty much not a thing anymore. Obviously, the whole ID card thing saying what your ethnicity was changed. The census doesn't even ask what you are anymore. If you would ask someone from Rwanda what they consider themselves to be, they would say Rwandan. But yeah, it's just a personal note. I donated a chunk of my childhood books to an orphanage in Rwanda at the time when the young baby orphans were becoming teens and young adults. I sent, I think, like 8 boxes, like huge boxes, to this orphanage in Rwanda to expand their library. Like, only 90s kids would understand this, but the Animorph books, I had every single book, every special, every spin-off. I had every single thing that was Animorphs. I loved those books. And when I was, I think, 15, when I was ready to donate, I realized that, you know, I was never going to read those books again. And how valuable would it be to some kid in their orphanage at Rwanda to have the entire, I mean, it's at least like 70 or 80 books, the entire Animorphs collection. So somewhere in Rwanda are a lot of my books from my childhood and teenage years, and I really hope that there's some people there enjoying them. But yeah, Rwanda's a really special country. One of those when you have such a massive national tragedy, there's either 2 outcomes. Either you learn from it or you don't. And Rwanda has definitely learned from it. So that's where I'm going to leave you tonight, the end of that story. As of now, it's a very happy ending. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good night. Good night. Good night.